Welcome to the Keto Geek Podcast. Let's do this.
Health, nutrition, fitness, low-carb lifestyle.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Keto Geek Podcast. My name is Fahad, and I am the host of this show. There is some great news for everybody. First of all, our Keto Geek Energy Pods have a new lid label on them, and it looks really cool. We've got some really positive feedback from everybody. If you check out our social media, such as Instagram or are part of our newsletter, you already know what I'm talking about. So you can order those with some new kick-ass labels. Secondly, the Department of Health in California has given us a green light as far as our pH testing and shelf stability and all that kind of jazz is concerned. What this translates into is that our product is shelf stable, and we don't need to add any preservatives or chemicals or any of that extra BS that is added to a lot of products. So that's a big deal for us because we wanted our products to remain as is. We already knew that they were shelf stable, but now we have a full confirmation and it's been lab tested by the Department of Health itself. So that's really great. And so what this practically translates into is that our product can now be thrown into the distribution channels. So expect it to be on Amazon or various stores across the country. So it's really cool. It took us about a year to get to this position, to get our products from starting to end, converge from all the science, talking to experts. Guys, it's been a huge journey, but we've finally done it. Our chocolate fudge energy pod is completed, and that will be the first product that gets into the pipeline. The pecan coconut one will be next. So you can go to ketogeek.com and order some of our amazing shelf-stable snacks. And we will soon be opening up a wholesale account for people who are interested in selling our product in their stores as well. So there's a lot of stuff that's coming up. And just to add a little bit more snippet, which pertains to this episode, our energy pods actually have a lot of saturated fat in them outside of just having nuts in them. And these fats come from animal and plant sources, ghee and MCT oil respectively. So there are several ways you can consume this. And we've been getting this question quite often. What do I do with this pod? Well, if it's at room temperature, you can just take the lid and turn it into a spoon and just eat it like a pudding. If you freeze it, you turn that pod into an ice cream so you can eat it that way. Now, some people have added our pod to their coffee or hot water and turned it into a mocha or a latte of some sort, which is really cool. So you can sort of do that as well. Another thing that I wanted to bring up is that our pods are 2 ounces each. So technically, if we were to make squeeze pouches out of one of our boxes, you would get 16 squeeze pouches or 16 nutrition bars in there based on the caloric sort of intake and so forth. Anyway, so moving onward, our nutty carnivore diet has been making some interesting progress. We're getting some positive anecdotes of people who have adopted this way of eating. Most of these people are ridiculously busy. They have a very productive day. They work 12 hours, 8 hours, 16 hours. And what they're finding out is they have energy throughout the day, no more hunger cravings, and eating out is just so easy. You can just go to a restaurant at the end of the day, get some steak, eggs, and all that kind of stuff. Even if you're at a gas station, you can get some sugar-free jerky, bacon, and sausage there. So it's really easy to adapt this nutty carnivore way of eating. That's what I've been doing myself. But at the same time, we don't want to close the doors on the plant kingdom yet. And if people can derive energy, pleasure, happiness, and wonderful experiences by including plants in their diet, I think that should be totally fine. In fact, I think that the pendulum can swing too far in one direction, and that limits our capacity to study specific foods for optimizing health, medicine, performance, all that kind of stuff. So I think we should just keep an open mind, and that's been the philosophy behind the nutty carnivore diet. However, I do think that the carnivorous diet is a great framework to start with. So this episode was interesting. We normally do a live stream every Sunday at 10 o'clock on Instagram. We have a back and forth conversation with all of the people that follow us. It's a fun little thing that we don't market too much. So if you do follow us on Instagram, you can check it out every Sunday. And one of the people brought up the name Peter Defty, and they said, hey, he would be a perfect guest for this show. And whoever it was, I don't remember the exact name or handle. You're right. This was a great podcast that we just finished. And who exactly is Peter Defty? So he promotes a fat-adapted training and takes all this science and actually makes it happen in the field. He's a triathlete and ultra-endurance coach of coaches, meaning like he's the god mode and he's been at it for about more than 2 decades and coached world-class athletes such as Zach Bitter, Timothy Olson, and so on. He works with great scientists like Dr. Stephen Phinney and Jeff Volek, and Dr. Jeff Volek was the one who published the FASTER study, which is the Fat-Adapted-Substrate oxidation in trained elite runners. Kind of complicated. Back in 2013. Peter's website is vespapower.com, spelled VESPAPOWER.com. And he was really kind enough to send some of his product samples my way. And if you check out the link in the show notes once you're done, you can get a 20% off your first order. And however, the order has to be about $50 minimum. I will be trying the products, and just to give you guys a little bit more snippet, I will be giving up on my yoga practice, and I'm thinking about picking up some sort of an ultra endurance sort of sport. So I might stack Vespa Power with my training and see how that pans out. Yeah, I'm kind of burned out on yoga for now. So this is actually going to be a very raw and powerful interview, and it was very eye-opening because it cuts through all the BS. So prepare yourselves for this. It goes and explores the dark side of performance athletics, and I think we just barely scratched the surface on so many topics. Peter is genuinely a really rich source of experience, knowledge, and everything. And he lives in the world of realism and practicality, which is something I love and respect. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me bring to you Peter Defty. Ladies and gentlemen, we've pulled the rock and found the great Peter Defty on board with us at our Keto Geek podcast. Peter, we're both locals in California. How's life?
Life is good. I mean, let's face it, we're in California, and yes, there's a drought, and that's the unusual thing, but I'm staring out at blue skies and 65-degree weather here in the Central Valley. So, yeah, life is really good.
Yes, and I keep sending these pictures on my social media just to brag about how the weather is over here. Yeah. So let's get straight into your story. People have been asking me consistently, please bring Peter on board. He knows a lot about the keto, low-carb performance, everything. You seem to be the hidden gem somewhere. So how did you get into this world?
Okay, well, my personal story started with me in 1999, approaching 40 years old. I kind of figured that was sort of the halfway point. And so I kind of started thinking, well, how do I want to spend the other half of my life? And so started exercising and started running and getting in shape and ran my first marathon and did everything I was supposed to do and bonked. Did the carb load and bonked, and it was ugly. And I thought about that. I said, well, this sure as heck doesn't work for me. And started to think about it in the context of some things I was reading and stuff, and was thinking about the Maasai and how they go all day and move long distances on a diet of meat, blood, and milk, essentially, and very little plant-based stuff. And I've never been a vegetarian or anything like that. I'm not against it, but I always ate meat, so it made a lot of sense to me. And so I instantly shifted to having a medium rare ribeye steak, some vegetables with some butter on it, and a loaded baked potato the night before my marathon. And lo and behold, I ran 3 marathons right after that and had no issues whatsoever. And I thought, wow, this is interesting. And that started my little journey. And I got into trail running and ultras at that point in the early 2000s, when it was still a sort of a underground sport, fringe sport. And it was before Dean Karnazes wrote his book, Confessions of an Ultramarathon Man, and before, Chris McDougall wrote Born to Run, well before that. And so that made a lot of sense to me, too, from a very natural standpoint, because I grew up hunting and chasing game along trails. And so this made all sense. So I started doing that and started coaching a few of my friends about this approach versus the carb loading approach. And we just kind of had consistent success. And then in 2006, I was drawn for the Western States 100-mile endurance run and started to train for that. So I was going from, doing 50K, 50-mile type trail ultras to 100-milers, and then went up to that and was using this strategy on myself and coaching a few friends on it, and not really, in a formal way, but just doing it very empirically, and not with any thought of it being a profession. And then I ran the 2006 Western States, and that year was the hottest year on record. And in the modern Western States finish rates, it's the one that had the lowest finish rate. It was like 52% of the field finished. So roughly half the field finished. And most of the modern times, people are finishing in the high 70s to low 80s is the finish rate. So huge drop. And there was only like 53 people who made it under 24 hours. And I was one of them. And that was my first ultra. And I didn't have any trouble doing so. I was just, went through the day fine despite the heat. And so for a guy who was a novice at it and just kind of learning, it was a pretty big thing. And it's like, there's something to this. And at that point, I just started using the Vespa product, which I'm a distributor for the U.S. And so that got me interested in the whole thing, because when somebody gave me the Vespa, because I'd already been following and open to the idea of using fat as fuel. This was in 2006 when people like Louise Burke and Chris Carmichael were basically saying there's nothing to fat adaptation. Phil Maffetone, the great Phil Maffetone, who's, one of the people I really look up to, he had basically punched out of training people like Mark Allen and Stu Middleman and gone into music. And the stuff he's done in music is just absolutely amazing. But he was basically had his head in the music game. So there was nobody really doing it. And everybody was saying fat has no place in athletics. And I was having these very different results. And when somebody gave me this pouch of Vespa and said, hey, my friend Mojo swears by this, I was open to that message, right? And so that led to me talking to the company, and they were struggling precisely because of the environment in that time was, it was all about the carbs. And so I got involved with them and bought an equity stake and became the distributor for the U.S. And that got me working on it full-time professionally. And when I first started out doing it, it was interesting because I was doing a lot of hands-on working with clients to support it, and we were having results that were across the board. Some people it worked great, some people it didn't work with, some people said it made them sick. So some of these people I started working with closely who had problems, and they were always like carbing up. And then that got me, because we were seeing these kind of results, I was like, okay, there's a problem here. And so I started really looking at this and started to work at getting the carbohydrates out and looking at what, the whole idea of tons of concentrated carbohydrates in the diet as any athlete would do, and how we would, affect your hormones, mainly the insulin response, and how the chronic ingestion of a lot of carbohydrates changed the function of insulin, which is something we really want to talk about for keto people, because that's a misconception in this world. Is insulin is like looked upon as the evil villain in for most keto most people in the keto sphere, because it's a problem for most people. So anyway, we started working with people, and lo and behold, we got their carbohydrates down and we got them physiologically fat adapted and using the Vespa and just a little bit of carbs, people started to perform. They'd get PRs, elite athletes would be winning races, setting course records, and we were getting these results that were, pretty off the charts, but yet everybody's saying, where's the science? Oh, this is anecdotal, can't be this, blah, blah, blah. And in 2010, a friend of mine said, hey, you need to talk to this guy, Steve Phinney, because there was an article in the Sacramento Bee about him. And he says, it looks like he's kind of like on board with what you're doing. He's doing something similar with obese people. And so I contacted Steve, and he lives in Elk Grove, which is, south of Sacramento. And we had lunch, and that was like that seminal point in 2010. We had this lunch, and he was the first researcher, because I was living in Davis, and that's home to Dr. Liz Applegate, who's like a rock star nutritionist. She's a senior research professor and lecturer at UC Davis, and she writes a column for Runner's World and all that. So she's very much pro high carb and all that, but all along, I'd have all these people saying, where's the science? And researchers saying, no, there's no credible evidence that this even works. And Steve was the first person that privately said to me, what you're seeing is not only real, it's powerful. But and that gave me that strength to go on. But also, at the same time, for Steve, this has been his like back burner passion is athletes, working with athletes in fat adaptation. And he kind of buried that, because when he published his cycling paper in 1983, it instantly went toxic. And he kind of had to keep that buried. So he was working more in obesity, type 2 diabetes remission, et cetera. And what he found with me was, here's somebody who's getting consistent results with a consistent group of people. And that means a data set, okay? Fahad, right?
Yep.
Okay. So that led us to discussing more and having exchanges where we could both learn and feed from each other, but it also led to the 2012 Western States study, which never got published because we really didn't have the data to put together a study that had that could go through a peer review at a very high level journal. But the data from that study in 2012 was so compelling, it led Drs. Phinney and Volek to piece together the funding to do the FASTER study. And the FASTER study is really seminal, and that really, it conclusively showed that humans are capable of burning much more fat at much higher intensities than the body of science to date previously said was even possible. Okay, and virtually all of the people in the low carb cohort, people I either coached and helped out to get them fat adapted. And the key for people to know is, in the FASTER study, they use straight keto, but in the real life, these athletes follow our OFM protocol and use the Vespa product, which does allow for a lot more carbohydrate utilization, depending on the circumstances, than say your straight keto dogma has, which we'll talk about, because it's very germane to the conversation of keto adaptation, fat adaptation, and performance athletics. So, but that led to it, and then at that point, then all the things myself and my athletes were saying about how much fat we were burning and how little calories we were needing during races sort of kind of had some validity. And I don't know how familiar you are with FASTER, but it hasn't really gotten the press it probably deserves, because you're taking the body of science to date that was saying most people burn about 0.5 gram of fat, and then the upper limit would be 1 gram, to having a cohort of athletes that are burning 1.4 grams and up to 1.8 grams, which is not just, it's strong, it's really statistically significant. It's not just an incremental increase, it's like a game changer. And yet, there's still this disconnect in the sports physiology world over it. A lot of people who don't buy into it say, well, that's just ultra endurance athletes. And, I just find that I've worked with CrossFitters and people who are doing gym, like resistance and HIIT type workouts. And when they follow our protocol, they can't believe what it does for the more higher intensity resistance type training.
Okay.
So that's sort of my story to date. And, we've got a lot of things that we're doing that's pretty out there and cutting edge. And that's been my focus because I think that all of this is highly individualized. So everybody's anecdotal. I think the science is a very important tool to use, but unfortunately it's been hijacked to become sort of that's what you do in the real world.
Yeah. So you've dropped the name Vespa. What exactly is it?
Vespa is, if you're not familiar with it, it's snake oil. But actually it's a synergistic blend of insect products from bees and wasps. And the key ingredient is a bioactive peptide we actually get from this giant wasp. And it's bioactive peptides. There's a lot of literature on them. A lot of doctors will, because they learn in medical school, when you ingest something, the stomach acids break proteins and peptides down into amino acids. But there's quite a bit of literature on bioactive peptides, which actually can, through what they call tight junction signaling at the gut barrier, that can actually pass through the gut barrier into the bloodstream intact and have a physiological impact. Psychedelic mushrooms are one. The protein of that, it breaks down in a peptide that can actually induce the psychedelic effect. There's some dairy proteins that have been shown to do that. And it's a big topic of research in pharmaceuticals, bioactive peptides, trying to reconstruct them. So this is a bioactive peptide we get from this giant wasp, and it's kind of one of these accidental discoveries of nature where Japanese entomologists were studying this wasp, and they could see it could fly 60 to 100 kilometers a day. It would carry about a third of its body weight in a food ball back to the colony and feed to the larvae. It's like, what makes this animal do that? And it's well known that bees, wasps, ants, and termites, in terms of endurance, stamina, and strength, they're like super animals in the animal kingdom because of what they can do and how long they can do it over their life cycle. And they do it mainly burning fat at a very high rate from their thorax because they can't ingest solid food. So what people don't realize is animal cells are very similar across species in terms of their physiology and metabolism. And so these Japanese entomologists surmise that if it had this effect on insects, it would have it on rats and humans and et cetera. So that's what Vespa is. So it's really a catalyst, and it's to supercharge your fat metabolism. And so it's kind of out there, and we haven't been able to do really good science. There's a few papers out of Japan, but I wouldn't call them really good science. And that's something we'll talk about later about science, because I think the consumer doesn't have the ability, nor do they need to, but they don't have the ability to really know how the whole journal ranking is and experimental design. So a lot of people think things that are published science are, if it's published, it's science, and it really doesn't work that way. And a lot of your nutrition and sports nutrition publications, when you really dig into the experimental design and look at the stats, it's not even science.
Let's talk about it. Let's pry this.
Yeah. What's that?
Let's pry this topic. Okay.
So I think May of 2016. There's a lot of intellectual dishonesty out there in academia. especially when it comes to this nutritional stuff, because it's so driven by funding from the nutrition companies, which have a lot of profits. And that's one of the problems with Vespa is we're using naturally occurring insect products, which makes it very prohibitive to make. A lot of your supplements and pharmaceuticals, the ingredient cost is very small. So it gives the profit margin high. So it gives these companies, and I'm not saying this I don't want to be negative. I'm just saying it as it is. This is how the game's played. Okay. But they have a lot of resources to do marketing and advertising. And so they'll do studies they'll help people design studies that fit their agenda. And so a lot of the published papers at our universities, a lot of these are actually funded by industry with an agenda. So they give you the results they would like to get. Okay. So, and then there's a lot of intellectual dishonesty in academia on this, where people will reference papers to the public because the public doesn't know, and because that person has credibility as a PhD, and as they should, they believe that if that person's endorsing that paper, it's good. And a good example is back in, I think it's a May issue of Runner's World, there was an article in the nutrition section on ultra runners, and the small study that was cited in it about carbohydrates being the fuel of choice for ultra runners was a study that got published, and it got published, okay? And a very well-regarded PhD nutritionist, rockstar nutritionist, was the one writing the article. Well, the sample size was a sample size of 3 to start with. And the sample size of 3 was we're doing a food questionnaire talking about their diet and their fueling. And food questionnaires are notoriously inaccurate. It's just well known. And so to start with, a sample size of 3 does not constitute a good data set. That's not science, a sample size of 3. And then food questionnaires don't constitute science unless you can back it up with some harder data. And so that's the kind of thing that goes on when you see, these articles that come out like red meat causes cancer, or things that come out on branched chain amino acids. It's very focused specific to that topic, but people don't recognize things like branched chain amino acids or maltodextrin and its performance enhancing things, or branched chain amino acids in terms of getting your proteins. They can show a physiological effect, but it's like I say, I get my branched chain amino acids by having a nice steak or eggs. And it's much cheaper, and it's much closer, it mimics much closer the amino acid profile that humans evolved to consume. And the thing is most of your branched chain amino acids, the ingredients come from byproducts of the dairy industry or the meat processing industry, and they're essentially waste products that have become, supplements, and there is a benefit to them. I'm not saying there isn't, but the hyperbole is just tremendous because they have the marketing to do it. It's just like one of my pet peeves is gelatin. I'm a big fan of gelatin, but it's a byproduct of the meat processing industry or animal processing industry, and it's essential for humans. I love to have people have gelatin in their diet, but all of a sudden you have collagen, which is gelatin, and then you have hydrolyzed collagen or hydrolyzed peptide proteins, and it's like there's all this flowery language to make it sound so much better when it's still a byproduct, and you can raise the price by putting these fancy names on it. And it's like, hydrolyzed collagen, peptides, or hydrolyzed gelatin. I mean, I tell people, if you want to use the hydrolyzed version because it dissolves easily in your Bulletproof coffee, that makes sense for convenience. But, the hydrolyzing is nothing more than what your stomach actually does when food contacts the acid in the stomach. They're just hydrolyzing with acid. So it's just kind of interesting to me how these highly profitable products, because they're they do have a low cost of acquisition for a manufacturer. They have that ability to do fund studies, fund marketing, do all this flowery advertising. Whereas when you look at things like fresh produce, eggs, dairy, meat, poultry, fish, you don't see a lot of that because there is no margin. An egg is an egg, unless you're doing and there is some marketing in terms of the range, the cage-free organic feed, or like in the beef, the pasture thing, but there is a difference, but you're paying a lot more for an incremental difference. And as I say with like eggs, the very best eggs, the very, very best eggs come from chickens that you don't really want to know what they're eating.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my rant, but it makes the science very confusing, and the consumer really does need to know that it's much more complex and nuanced than people know. I think the China study is a very good example, and if anybody wants to see how bad science gets, and this is considered good science by most consumers, right? The China study is a seminal study, right? Everybody, big deal.
Let's talk about it, just to give them an idea.
Well, the China study was done by T. Colin Campbell, and it essentially the take-home message was, you want to be plant-based and you want to get animal products out of the diet. And the actual China study is over 1,000 pages long, but the condensed book is very short. And I think the person that I'm going to give most of the credit to is Denise Minger. I think she's a very, very cute, but very, very extremely bright stats geek up in Oregon who totally debunked it to the point where she and T. Colin Campbell started having some exchanges, but then he ignored her when she would go through all the tables and the statistics and point out the errors. Chris Masterjohn was also a part of dissecting the China study and showing how some of the studies that in fact T. Colin Campbell did early in his career actually contradicted some of the conclusions he was drawing from the China study. So Denise, if anybody wants to look at that, just do a Google lookup of Denise Minger China study, and you'll get way more information than you ever wanted to read, and that'll show you. You won't have to go through it because it is complicated and very thorough, but you'll see what real science is, and it's a lot of hard grinding through that in our copy and paste culture and this whole Twitter frenzy in politics right now. Our world is being condensed down to this 140 character bullshit. I can't say it any other way. It's BS.
This is R18.
What do you see what I'm saying? My point is we're moving towards getting our information in smaller and smaller bites. Yet if anybody is actually stepping back and thinking, how do you learn anything in a 140 character soundbite? And so it's like I say, the more I learn, the less I know. Or as a college professor said to me at UC Davis, 30 some odd years ago, you take one class on a subject, you know everything on that subject. You take 2 or 3 classes and you realize you don't know anything. And so that's my message about these scientific papers that get published and put out in the news. And usually the ones that make a lot of press are the ones that I would caveat that should be people should be very skeptical of, because you just can't do that. And then the second part of that that's really important and germane to this topic is science is about controlling the variables to look at one aspect. And when we're talking about human nutrition, human health, human physiology, athletics, that's what science does. So, but how does that work in the real world? It doesn't. Okay, the real world has tons of variables. It's very dynamic, which means a lot of these variables are constantly changing. So it's not that the science does not have import. It has tremendous import in helping us to understand and guide us. But when you look at these big studies, and I think the keto thing is one thing. is you have people that just they literally are crapping their pants if somebody goes over 50 grams, or they have a teaspoon of sugar in their coffee. And because the science, the data set kind of comes out that this is over an average data set of a whole bunch of people, the tolerance range is between 30 and 50 grams. Well, it really depends on the individual. So going back to each listener here, each one of you is an individual and an N of one, and your situation, your variables are, multivariate. A lot of those variables are very dynamic, so they're changing. So we can use the science to help us understand how each piece fits into the puzzle, but that science is not your guide to put that puzzle together. That makes sense. I think one of the key things is the whole red meat thing. They always cite the plant-based agenda people, and I don't mean that. Once again, I don't mean that in a disparaging way, but people with a plant-based agenda love to cite how red meat causes cancer, heart disease, etc. But, in the science, when you look at people who are more plant-based, they tend to be very much more health conscious, whereas people who eat a lot of meat, and I mean too much meat, I'm going to be with them on that, too much meat, because it's too much muscle meat, they tend to have other variables in that haven't been controlled, like smoking, alcohol, lack of exercise, a whole bunch of other variables that are confounders that don't tell the whole. So the red meat doesn't tell the whole story.
Yeah. Do you know about this group called Paleomedicina in Hungary?
Who?
Paleomedicina in Hungary, by any chance?
No, I'd love to hear about it.
So we had them on the podcast, and they literally pitch a practically all meat diet against cancer. So that basically destroys the argument, it seems like, in just one fell swoop. So
okay, so I would think that because they're Hungarian, they're old school European, they're eating the whole animal, which is key.
Yeah.
Okay, so they're eating organ meat, they're eating skin and connective tissue. They're not wasting one scrap of that animal. Okay, and that's really key. And what I found, and I was actually IMing with an athlete in Okinawa this morning who was picking up weight because he had to back off of his training load because of work and a knee issue that's since resolved itself. And one of the things we consistently see when you get the nutritional availability, density, and balance, nutritional balance just right, the amount of food somebody needs to eat is really, really tiny, and animal products play a key role in that. So this idea that you have to be eating, 12-ounce, 16-ounce New Yorks and ribeyes all the time doesn't, even though I do indulge in that once in a while, it's not what I see, what the tea leaves are telling me is actually best. It's like it's amazing how little we need to eat when we really have this down and how good we feel. And then when you look at the one aspect of long-term longitudinal studies across the board, one thing stands out is the less you eat, the longer you live. And now that's correlation. It's not causation. What's causing that? I don't know. But what we're finding is when you get that nutritional balance just right with the nutritional bioavailability, it's almost astounding how little one needs to eat, and it makes total sense to me now. And I don't find this as a bias. I find this as just facts of looking at the science of anatomy. When you look at the human digestive tract, our digestive tract is much closer to a dog's than a pig's. Pigs and bears are what I would consider true omnivores because they do have a large, well-developed cecum and colon. But they're single stomach. They have some acid digestive capabilities, but not really too much. But they also have a good hindgut, and they have a large cecum. And we don't even have a cecum, or we have a very undeveloped cecum. Our appendix provides most of that role. And so we have, while our biome is important, and while we do have that capacity to process and digest plant-based nutrition, and essentially survive, reproduce, and have relatively good health off of it, it's more of a backup system because we're not ruminants. It's like I say to my vegetarian friends, I have my eyes in the front of my head and I only have one stomach. And it's just, I'm saying that jokingly, but it's a hard fact. And you look at how biological systems work and where we fit into that cycle of life. We're omnivorous carnivores. We're predators. I mean, that's why we have our eye set principally in the front of our head and why we have canine teeth. Now, the reason we don't have big canine teeth is because we developed tools in cooking and probably started out eating more rotten flesh as scavengers before we became outright hunters. So we didn't have to develop the flesh tearing canines that other carnivores like a dog would have. Okay. So that's my sort of assessment of that. But when you look at our digestive tract, we're not hindgut digesters. Like when we separate from the great apes, gorillas, when you look at a gorilla's digestive tract, they're a hindgut digester. Their colon is twice as long and twice as large as ours. And we just don't have that digestive capability to get optimal nutrition from a plant-based diet. Now, all that being said, I don't think that we have to be, because animal-based nutrition is so nutritious, we don't have to have a lot. And then when you look at like Alan Savory's Savory Institute work and how he's restoring grasslands back to their natural habitat because they've become desertified, they become deserts, and how ruminant herds fit into that biological system, and how taking these large ruminant herds out destroys the grasslands. And you not only need those large ruminant herds, but you also need the predators to bunch them. And that's where sort of we fit in. I think a lot of the reason humans, because we had the brain and we had the adaptive ability and we had the bipedal motion to move long distances, one of the things that caused us to disperse across continents was that we followed the ruminant herds, the large ruminant herds of animals, whether they were, ancestors of cow or caribou or whatever. We followed these great migrations because they did represent a stable food supply.
Yeah. Yeah, this is some of the stuff that you're mentioning here is in a book called The Stone Age Diet. And it's fascinating how some of this knowledge comes back to you, which is about 40, 50 years ago, written down in a book. So let's say that I'm a researcher and I just graduated college, I got a job offering, and I'm given a study, and I'm like, this just does not make sense. It goes against my philosophy. What do you have advice for those people? What can they do?
Well, so this is something I'm actually writing about, and it goes back to some very primitive hardwiring. So all of my what I do is I always go back to what were the evolutionary pressures that shaped us as humans. I always constantly ask that thing. So in terms of this, we have what's called conformational bias in science, and we all have it. We're all, and what I call it is we're all right in our own mind, and so that rightness is primitive hardwiring because that's what allowed us to survive. And we developed different strategies based upon that rightness, whether it was conscious or subconscious. And even being passive aggressive or passive is a way of being right in our own mind. That sometimes being passive is the way to survive. So we're all right in our own mind one way or another. Some of these politicians we have now are very right in their own mind. And so you have to recognize in this modern world we live in that can have some unintended consequences, that there are other perspectives, other pathways. And so you have to be willing to understand that we do have this bias, we do have this rightness, and be willing to step away from it to see what other possibilities are. It doesn't necessarily mean one's wrong, but it might mean that maybe there's a nuance to what one's thinking, or that there are other paths that are just as valid. And then over time, that kind of changes one's perspective or vision, but you have to be willing to look very objectively. That's one of those things that's very hard for us to do as humans when we develop these belief systems based on that data. And then when we see this data that just contradicts us, you go back to your talking points, which is very well deployed in religion and politics. People just, if they see something, that totally comes in contrast to what their belief system is, they just fall back to their talking points and just completely shut it out, which, can have fatal consequences for people.
Yeah. Yep. And I think we've pounded this down several times that paradoxes can lead to amazing breakthroughs. And so are there any relevant studies besides FASTER that you think are worth mentioning here that intrigued you?
Steve Phinney's seminal study in the early 80s did, and then Paul Larson down in New Zealand did one a couple of years ago too, where it was with relatively sedentary and somewhat athletic people, where he's showing that fat was burned at a higher intensity than was previously thought, and they elucidated some of the physiological mechanisms and how lactate load was masking. The lactate load was masking the respiratory quotient, so that you couldn't see what contribution fat was making at higher intensities. But FASTER kind of showed but to say that, FASTER also showed that clearly you could burn fat at high rates of fat at much higher intensities without the lactate load. And that's one of the things that we look at very carefully, because we're not just looking at the front end of how fast you're going to run or how much power wattage you're going to put out on the bike or how many deadlifts you're going to do, but we're also looking at how you, for lack of a better term, because I want to rephrase this, recover. And what I've come to find is it's not about recovery. The whole recovery, I don't know, I don't know how athletic you are or follow athletics, but recovery is a big deal, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody talks about recovery. It's one of these buzzwords that's a total misnomer, because the approach really should be, and this is where we approach it, is it's not about recovering faster, it's about doing less damage in the first place. And so that recovery phase, we are looking at the physiology of fat burning, because it produces less oxidative stress, less lactate load, so that you quote unquote recover faster. You don't recover faster, you just don't do the damage. So you don't have that sort of thing. So you recover faster, quote unquote, so you can handle a higher training load and train up better.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. So how's the world of marathon running, ultra running, how's that changing, if at all, or are we still stuck in the high carb dogma?
I think it's changing, but we're still rolling that rock uphill, and there's still a long ways to go. But I think that now that FASTER is out there, we have data, and it's good data that nobody's been able to refute. So it's going to change, but it's going to change one athlete at a time, because I think one of the things is right now, especially with this copy and paste culture we're living in and this soundbite sort of messaging, it's led to a lot of binary thinking and polarization of people. So it's either or, it's not something in between. And contextually, it really is something in between and nuanced. And like I said, it's individualized for every person. And so this brings me to the whole thing. It's like, we're obviously on a very keto, low carb, fat-based, biased podcast. So the listeners are going to tend to do that. Well, we all know that the high carb camp completely ignores the downside consequences of chronic consumption of concentrated forms of carbohydrate. I mean, they just totally gloss over the fact that, an athlete who's consuming 60-70% of their macro as concentrated carbs like pasta and stuff like that, they're just basically might as well be eating sugar. You know, they ignore that. But at the same time, the keto, like I said earlier, the keto camp is so dogmatic in the keto thing that it's like an athlete that, you know, I've had people ask me to return, if they can demand they return their Vespa because it's got 4 grams of honey in it.
Wow.
you see, you know, and like I said, you know, you have people crap in their pants if they go over 50 grams. And so you have this binary thought, it's either or, right? And the problem is the keto camp needs to recognize that what we're seeing in this athletic thing, especially when we do it the way we do, where we're focusing on optimizing your metabolism of fat, and it's optimizing it not just for the energy utilization, but for the physiological aspects, because metabolizing fats and lipoproteins, which are fats with proteins attached to them, that's key for muscle, cell renewal, rejuvenation, hormones, enzymes, all your biological processes, because concentrated carbs are nothing but a quick burning energy source. Whereas real food, lipoproteins and lipids are very complex things that not only offer dense energy, but they also offer tons of other essential nutrients, minerals, et cetera, you know, to maintain health, vitality, strength, and stamina. So we focus on that. And by doing so, what happens is when you build up that fat burning physiology, and then part of that is building it up, once you make that dietary shift, then building it up aerobically, because you burn fat aerobically, right? You build your aerobic base up. All of a sudden, because you've gone keto or you've gotten the fat adaptation, that window of carbohydrate tolerance opens way up. And then and this is the beauty of it. If you start getting keto adapted and then start exercising, that window opens way up. And then as that window opens way up, the flexibility and the sustainability of maintaining a lifestyle that keeps you carb tolerant and fat adapted, it becomes seamlessly easy. Because you're not craving the concentrated carbohydrates and having those energy and mood swings that demand you get your carbs now. But when you do have them, they don't have an impact. Like if you go to my website and dig through the pages, one of the things I've kind of thought about and come up with is we look at concentrated forms of carbohydrates as a legal PED. You know, because they fit that exact definition. They're a performance enhancing drug, and they're legal, but they do have their downside consequences. And if you adopt that frame of mindset, well, then we can employ carbs occasionally in a fat adapted athlete who's not metabolically broken to actually increase performance. And I think that there's been a disconnect within the keto community, and it's the community, the camp I'm in, about the carbohydrates, because everybody's been so dogmatic about anti-carb that we're not recognizing the benefits of carbohydrates in terms of athletic performance.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Yeah. So, you know, in all the literature in ketosis, including Steve's bike study and everything that I've seen in the literature and seen in real world performance, you can get 80, 85, maybe even a hyper responder can get 90% there in terms of performance, and they can go all day long and all night long, steady state, like Sammy Inkinen did rowing a boat to Hawaii. But you just don't have that top gear, and you bring in the carbs. But what we found is with the faster study athletes I work with, when we get them adapted, really get that fat burning up, and then bring the carbs in, the carbs are like rocket fuel, and they work sustainably, and you're taking in so much less, and they're having such a much more powerful effect, and they're also not having that impact, that negative downside impact that chronically consuming them would.
Okay. And I don't know if you know about this community called Ketogains. I followed their protocol, and they add about 10 grams of dextrose or a fast-absorbing carb before workouts or high-intensity training. So I am not averse to carbohydrate intake. I don't know if this is the best way to do it, by the way, since I'm not an expert on this matter.
No, those guys, Luis and Tyler are great people, and Zach, and they do have it down. That's exactly what I would tell people to do is make sure your sodium's up, so you have your blood volume up, and get a little fast acting sugar in there, because once you're going, it just doesn't affect you. And once again, everybody in the keto community is like anti-carb, but that's like we were talking earlier, insulin's also an issue, because insulin's been demonized, and what a lot of people fail to recognize is in a low basal insulin individual who's not metabolically broken and has their basal insulin levels low and their insulin sensitivity high, insulin, is very anabolic if it's used properly. But people forget that because we've just so bludgeoned ourselves with carbohydrates that we've lost that insulin sensitivity. And so what I describe it is we're taking insulin, which is really and truly a fine scalpel that a surgeon would use on cosmetic surgery, and we're using it like a sledgehammer to drive blood sugar down. We're just using insulin the wrong way. And so there's all these nuances that like I was saying, is we have our keto camp, which is definitely onto something that's real. Then you have this high carb sports camp that's in total denial of what's going to happen down the road. They're just, and that's why I say it's a legal PED, because, people will take PEDs even though they're illegal. And the reason they're illegal is because, we don't want people to not only cheat, but we don't want them to hurt themselves long term. We've seen what amphetamines did to people with sports. We know that people that are on high doses of EPO, if they get off the bike, they got to get on a trainer to keep moving. Otherwise their blood gets so thick they die. So that's kind of where it sits, and that's part of that human being, like you were asking me about the scientists trying to overcome their bias. That's sort of where we are with this very primitive thinking, that this quick messaging has kind of got us, and I know what I'm saying is kind of like going to get some people I'm going to lose in the weeds. And I know you're a geek, so you love talking about this stuff, but it's much more nuanced and individualized, and I encourage people to kind of recognize that they're still an individual, and these are guidelines more than absolutes.
Peter, to be honest, I and some of the people in our community, we've technically walked out from the whole keto buzz that's going on. We're more focused on get some good food in there. If you're going to be chasing ketones at the expense of performance or your life goals or good quality food, then I don't know if that's the best way to do it. So, but maybe in the performance realm, there's a bit of a disparity there. So what's your take on that?
Well, as I said, I go to the fundamental question. My fundamental question is, what were the evolutionary pressures that shaped us as humans? And there's a few papers out there, anthropological papers, that kind of are suggesting that primitive man was as fit, if not fitter, than today's elite athletes.
Yeah.
In so many ways physically, and so my goal is we start with the physical, and when you look at that, okay, primitive man had concentrated forms of carbohydrates 3 to 5 times a year. Wouldn't you agree? When fruit was ripe, or berries were ripe, or tubers were ripe, or they found honey. 3 to 5 times a year, not 3 to 5 times a day for decades. So there's your first thing. So they're mainly eating animals and having pretty much low carb type stuff. And like I said, I suspect that a lot of us were following great ruminant herds, and then we domesticated ruminant herds because they represented a very stable food source. And as a vegetarian Nicolette Hahn Niemann wrote, she's married to Bill Nyman of the Nyman Ranch, who you probably know of. The Nyman Ranch beef over in Tamales Bay.
I'm an ignorant fool.
Anyway, well, she's a vegetarian who married a cattle rancher, and she had a, literally a come to Jesus meeting with her belief system, because she saw that here we are in the first world as plant-based people preaching this don't eat animals, and then when she looked across the world, most of the world, third world people, depend on their small herds of animal, whether they're Maasai or herders in the Sahara, on their animals as a major part of their food source. And so that's what we evolved to. So back on track here, I look at that as, okay, so we ate mostly a low carb diet most of the time, but we did have these sporadic things of having carbs, and that's where the mechanism of insulin and fat storage really work well, but not if you're doing it chronically 3 to 5 times a day for decades. So where I'm going with this is we try to get every athlete to get as much as they can by eating a whole food, generally fresh food diet. And we try to do it in a way that doesn't stress them out. So if somebody doesn't absolutely have to count macros, we look at suggesting real food sources that kind of fit in those macros, and getting people to look at what they're eating and take an intuitive approach, so that by a year or two down the road, they just know what to eat. And, shopping sales, because I don't think that, a lot of people don't have the resources nor the time to go to farmer's market or go out to see the source, buy their cow, see it butchered, and all that. And so, or go to Whole Paycheck and spend a ton of money on, your very expensive beef and produce. So I suggest people shop the sales in supermarkets. Eggs are a bargain. I mean, I'm not going to disagree that there's better eggs out there, but when you look at the price of a commercially raised egg, it's dirt cheap for what you're getting. Okay, liver, they give away stuff. I mean, you can do this on the cheap, and then you buy produce in season. You can have a little bit of fruit in your diet once you're adapted, and you just stay away from the crap. And I don't want people to be, I don't want it to be forbidden, anything to be forbidden. But if you get yourself off the cravings, you can usually control them pretty well. And so I don't want people to have a denial complex. And this leads us to the other subject of stress and cortisol, chronic stress and cortisol, which is just as big an issue as carbohydrates. And, we see this a lot. So we look at those kind of things in a holistic thing. So your food, and then your lifestyle, your stress levels. And then we will, depending on how much volume of exercise you're doing, we do tend to do a little bit of supplement, and usually from natural sources. I think that almost everybody, unless they're actively doing something about their vitamin D and magnesium, almost everybody is deficient in those two things. I've not seen a person yet that, unless they were actively pursuing maintaining high vitamin D levels and magnesium, just because of the environment we live in doesn't allow us to get enough today. Mm-hmm. Okay, so those are key things, and the other thing is, I think our magnesium, the medical reference range, again, contextually, when you look at when it was developed and the environment in which it was developed, I think it's too low. So the 30 to 100 reference range in the medical things is, to me, and I'm willing to say this, I'm going to be the guy that gets, you don't have science, you're an idiot. Somebody's got to say it, right? Somebody's got to say the world's round when people believe it's fat. But like in the vitamin D, I think anything below 50 milligrams per deciliter is deficient. Not 30, but 50. And I like to see people above 70.
Yeah. Well, we're changing the food pyramid. I mean, this keto movement is definitely, or the low carb movement, or whatever it is, there's a huge paradigm shift that's going on over here. We?
Yeah, and
go ahead.
And I don't think it's also found like it is. And the thing is, it's real food, but I think the amount of fat that people need to consume is much less than they think, because there's been a lot of there's that byproduct of the keto movement, like the Bulletproof coffee movement, where people are just, they're down in the Bulletproof coffees, the MCT oils, the fat bombs, and that's a little misguided too. And especially if you're trying to lose weight, you need to be factoring in your own body fat.
Yeah.
As part of that fat macro.
Yeah. And we're noticing that on social media where people drown their entire plate in butter. I'm like, why are you doing that? Your goal is fat loss. So it just doesn't make sense. I don't know, man. So
yeah. And one of the things that we're also seeing that's come up is when we get people doing this well, Fahad, protein assimilation from real food proteins, animal proteins, become so high that certain people that are predisposed to putting on muscle mass, they really have to drop their protein down. I'm generally a protein advocate for people who are very active physically, but I've got some athletes whose genetic lines are they'll look at a kettlebell or a set of weights and they'll put on muscle mass. And so this when you get this physiological shift really going well and your biome all dialed in, I'm going back to this whole thing of it's just amazing how little you need to eat.
Yep. And that's what we're noticing anecdotally, at least in our community, that our appetites are going down, our sweet tooth is disappearing, and we just eat once a day, maybe just a piece of steak and egg and a couple of steaks maybe, and then we're not wanting more than that. It's crazy.
Yes, that corroborates with what I've seen. It's like a healthy, metabolically fit male should have one main meal a day and maybe a light snack or a light meal if he's exercising and maybe a coffee with a little cream in it. That's about it. And a female, 2 to 3 meals a day. I think females, from a biological, natural standpoint, they're just hardwired to eat and save for two. So it's a much more complex paradigm with a female. It's not that it can't be done, but it's a much more complex and very fascinating paradigm because of the delicate hormonal balance that women have and the fact that they're literally nature designed them to eat and save for two. And then the fact that the whole keto thing is a very elusive thing sometimes for females. Yet when you look at it from step back and look at it in the biological system thing, keto is the big party at childbirth. Mm-hmm. Animals, not just human animals, but other animals, it's well studied in dairy cattle, but they go into ketosis. It's even studied in orangutans. There was a researcher going around the jungles of Borneo with urine sticks getting peed on by female orangutans and how they went into ketosis at childbirth and lactation. So it's actually a very natural state for a female, but the female's saving it all up for when they need it. It makes, like I said, when you look at it in the paradigm of the environment that shaped us, it makes total sense. Same with the carbs, eating the carbs and putting on fat. But when you look at today's environment, it's got unintended consequences.
I don't know if this is just a light humor maybe in there, but if you notice how seeds, even in the plant kingdom, they shift to the fats that are within them for fueling them for their early years as well. So technically, I guess plants are in ketosis too when they're born. So it's all about fats and oils. I mean, carbohydrates are just cheap, accessible energy sources, and it's how it works with seeds. I mean, I've got my biological degree is actually in plant science. And part of the reason plant shift their seeds and oils around is they use MUFAs and PUFAs, unsaturated fatty acids and polyunsaturated fatty acids, which is why I'm sort of like not against eating some seed and nut crops as I'm not like it's not something I'm against, but I think a lot of this hyperbole about eating a lot of polyunsaturates and monounsaturates is kind of misguided, because when you look at MUFAs, PUFAs, and saturated fats from a purely organic chemistry standpoint, the reason saturated fats accumulate is because they're the most stable, less prone to oxidation. They're the best fats, not the evil fats, because they are so stable and they don't oxidize, whereas,
PUFAs are very prone to oxidation. And then you have, like in a lot of these seed oils, you have a high estrogen, phytoestrogen content, which is going to have unintended consequences if you're eating them in high amounts.
Yeah. So all these fats, various kinds of fats, I would imagine they would impact performance. Or they don't?
They do, and that's why you have to have the right amount of fats for the right context. Like Steve, Phinney, and I have talked about this with PUFAs. It's like you do need your omega-3s, your essentially your DHA and your EPA, but you need just the appropriate amount, nothing more, because if you have more than your body's going to use, it's going to hang around and be prone to oxidation. Okay. And then one of the interesting things about fat-adapted athletes is the body will prefer to burn saturated fat, and it has all the hormonal and enzymatic upregulation to be able to do that at a high rate. Okay, so saturated fats, and that's one of the things people don't get about this is when you're really active like we are, where you have people able to run 100 miles on less than 1,000 calories of intake for that entire duration, you're burning saturated fats, and you're not having that oxidative stress or lactate load from doing so. So your body will actually prefer that, but it's a very complex thing. And because we've, for decades, and the science that's been studying us for decades, has been following a relatively high carbohydrate diet, we see the saturated fat accumulate rather than because it's the last to get burned off in your normal meaning normal in the false paradigm of today's modern world. Normal in the primitive world, our bodies were able to use, it would take in and store a bit of saturated fat, and then it would metabolize it right back off. But when you have chronically high blood sugar, guess what? As people, as any type 1 diabetic will tell you, if they don't titrate themselves with insulin, they die. Well, every but one of us, when we eat a lot of carbohydrates, we're getting a toxic load of insulin. Our body knows how to deal with it. But in that moment when it's toxic, it's sort of like crisis management. The body's trying to drive that blood sugar down. So saturated fat being a safe thing in that moment isn't going to kill us in that moment. So it's not going to get metabolized. And our liver will convert sugars and other fats into saturated fat and just, store it. And so you get this accumulation rather than utilization. Okay.
So before an endurance exercise or performance, this was a community question. Should you go fasted or should you do something else?
What we tend to do, which seems to work really well, is we do intermittent fasting, and in the days leading up to it, really low carb, and then the day before we'll start to eat well, and that'll include some carbohydrates. And we do what we call a carb sneak, which is we sneak the carbs in under a blanket of fat. And that's going to include protein and other things. It's not just a carb load, but that's how we do it, because with that fasting, and then when you look at the original carb loading studies out of Sweden in the 50s, that brought about the advent of the high carb athletic diet. You have to look at the context is so important. Those studies are very good studies, very well done studies, and they're seminal studies, but it was at a time when red meat was still regarded as important for athletes. Okay, so there wasn't this fat phobia, red meat phobia then. So these were young, competitive males, so high testosterone. They were eating meat and protein, and they put them through carb restriction. They didn't, it wasn't full-blown keto, but it was carb restriction for the 2 weeks before they loaded them, and then loaded them back up. We do something a little bit similar, but not quite as extreme. Not a 3-day load, but like a 1.5 day load. And when I say load, it's not a load in the sense that they're eating 70-80% of their meals as carbohydrates. They're probably around 40 to 50% of their macro is carbohydrate. And so, but we put them through a fasting period because, in that little taper after their last hard workouts, they're not working out as their volume's is low, so they don't need to eat much. So they get that fasting, they get the hormonal resetting that gives them that, and then we bring back some food. So some of the workouts now for training, there's times when training fasted is very appropriate, and then there's times where having a little something might help drive that workout. But most of the time, most athletes, once they're fat adapted, they really don't want to have, if they've eaten well, their previous meal before that has been good, they're fine. But we have a lot of people that'll go 24-hour fast, do a workout, and then eat. It's just people tend to, I think people tend to know what to do once they practice and play with it, and that's why I encourage like this kind of discussion and looking at the science and learning from it, and then playing with it and seeing what works and doesn't work, and noticing those consistent patterns for you, because it's just so contextual and dynamic, and then people can get so much out of this,
Yeah. So what about salt intake? Like these, how you watch the TV and everybody's just chowing down these sugary drinks in between. I mean, that I would imagine in context of a high carb diet, but is there any benefit to upping, or should you be watching out your electrolyte intake while you're performing?
Okay, so this is an important subject because hydration, electrolyte management becomes a little bit more critical when you're trying to physically perform on keto, and it's well known in ketogenic diets that you do have to add salt back in, otherwise your blood volume goes down, and you're having those feigning spells when you're getting up. So it becomes a little bit more dynamic, and what we're seeing is the swings in hydration, which is water plus the electrolytes, can go way up. I mean, hugely. I mean, right now in the dead of winter, on a cold day, somebody will use very little, but then in the summer, I mean, they're going through, grams of, a gram an hour of salt.
Whoa.
Sodium. Yeah. And sweating it all out because and it's mostly salt. Sodium is the main component. It's the main driver of extracellular fluid, whereas potassium is the main driver of intracellular fluids. And, there's other electrolytes too, but those are the main drivers of the different extracellular. So as your blood volume can contract really quickly if you're not getting enough sodium. And this is where you can become hypovolemic really easily, even though you're taking in a lot of water. And this is where it can get dangerous because people, if they don't replace their electrolytes enough and they take in too much water, that can dilute down the electrolytes to where you can have, you can literally short circuit because you don't have enough of electrolytes in your fluids. So it's key to have that right ratio, but it's such a dynamic environment that you have to kind of understand it. And there's people doing these sweat tests where they're measuring your sweat and how much you need. But I find that highly questionable because people, again, they'll measure it and then they'll take that static measurement and try to apply it to every condition. And like their needs in the middle of winter are going to be very different from their needs in the middle of summer. And like even an athlete, it doesn't matter whether they're doing CrossFit or HIIT versus endurance, but if they're training in the winter and they're not sweating much and their electrolytes are a lot less, and then they hit the spring, those first couple of days, they'll need tremendous amount of salt. But then as they adapt to working out in the heat all the time, their body's going to adapt and use less and less sodium. And so even though they're using more sodium overall, that rate of sodium loss is going to be less. Does that make sense?
Oh, that makes some sense. So jack up your stuff in winter?
No, in summer.
Oh.
You'll need some more over not being keto adapted, but in the summer you really got to watch it. But when you come out of the cold winter, going into spring, those first warm days, your body hasn't adapted. So those, per unit of sweat, you're going to be excreting more sodium than you would like in August after you've trained for a couple of months in the heat. Your body adapts.
Okay, got it.
It's just so dynamic. And then as you go back into winter, it's just such a dynamic thing. And I don't have, a specific answer. And like, I had one athlete who just recently came on. He did a race a couple of weeks ago, and he was trying to adhere to it. I said, you'll probably use less. And he tried to stay with his plan, and he overhydrated, picked up like 4 or 5 pounds, and really had a bad race. And then this last weekend, he raced and won, and he backed way off, and it was warm. And even though he won, he still had some issues because he probably was a little bit behind. And that's how dynamic it can be. And that's what, once again, going back to that whole thing about how we use science to guide us, but don't make it the absolute, because you have these variables in the real world. 2 weeks ago, the race he had, it was cold and damp. The race he had last weekend, it was warm, sunny, and in the 70s. Okay, that variable changed, and if you're trying to, hold a scientific paper, adhere to what that scientific paper says, which is what tends to go on right now. You see all these people online doing battle with their published publication swords.
Yeah.
They're throwing, you see these threads where each one's throwing these papers, citing these papers against each other. And it's like, okay, these papers are good, and there's a lot we can glean out of them, but we have to think about it and use it in the context rather than try to develop a simple dogmatic message from the paper and then just apply it to the real world.
Yeah. Yep. So you just talked about different environments as well. So is there a fat adaptive advantage as far as specific environments are concerned? I'm speaking in terms of some of the research that people like Dr. Dominic are doing, Dr. Bickman are doing regarding brown fat acquisition and some of those things. Or is that just...
Well, I think that, okay, so they're doing some really high-level research, and a lot of it has to do with treating disease, correct? So I think for most, I want to lay the consumer so that they're not overthinking it and not going to the science too much. But if you're not too metabolically broken and you get yourself fat adapted, somewhat keto adapted, but not hardcore keto, and you become active, physically active, okay, to where you can go for 2 or 3 hours and not bonk and not feel like you're wrecked for the rest of the day, and you just have that ability to tap into your fat reserves. Between your body and your biome, it's going to figure it out. Okay, so it's going to create the amount of brown fat versus clear fat. And all that. One of the things I have a lot of athletes notice about in the winter when they get fat adapted is because their thermoregulatory capacity is so markedly increased that they're always cold all the time. They notice the cold more.
Interesting.
Okay. And that's sort of an adaptation. And that's where, doing some of the Wim Hof work to adapt to being in the cold might be of benefit. But, of course, I live in California, and the people I'm working with, or I've got an athlete back on the East Coast, and she's lost some weight, she's gotten lean, but she was also running in the, that East Coast heat and humidity all summer. And then, she's gotten herself lean. So, you have to be smart about that, because when you tap in, the thing to know is when you tap into fat burning, keto is a buzzword, and it's an easy thing because we can measure ketones, but fat metabolism is a much more profound thing, and it's not just what I talked about earlier about metabolism for energy and metabolism for cells and hormones and enzymes, but it's one of these things where you're when you look at fat beta oxidation, which is what's doing the real heavy lifting in fat metabolism, it's happening on a mitochondrial level, and you're able to tap into this tremendous heat source. So once you get it going, you're producing a lot of energy and a lot of heat. So I think that swing with a lot of people, their pores open up, they respire really well, which is why we really focus on hydration, because if you can't thermoregulate, you can't get the benefit of fat adaptation, the full benefit. And so that swing, like they go from the homeostasis of being really active and warm and then stop, and then 5 minutes later they're shivering. It's just just that big a swing. Like I see that with myself. It's like I can be out in 30 degree weather and running without a shirt on if I'm warmed up and everything, that machinery is up and running. But as soon as I stop, I better get toweled off and into warm clothes, because 5 minutes later I'll be freezing cold.
Okay. So how does the physiology change in the athlete from a high carb to a fat burning environment? What are some of the things you might have noticed?
Specify that question more. Are you talking about how do they do it, or what do I see?
I was listening to one of your talks, and you mentioned that some of the motor skills are affected by it, and some of the various functions could potentially benefit from being on a fat burning mode. Is that true, or?
Yes, and I can explain why. And this is the subtle thing that people don't get because we can't measure it. See, that's the problem. Is a lot of this stuff. Cognitive function, motor skills, it's very difficult to measure in a real hard data way. And we love to measure, and that's what science is based on. Is measurement. That's why ketones and ketosis is the big buzzword, because we can't measure beta oxidation. We can only use proxies, right? So with motor skills, what happens with fat adaptation is when you get that machinery in place and you're tapping into that sustainable energy source, you're tapping into saturated fat, and you're just cleaving off the ATPs through beta oxidation at a steady rate, you become blood sugar stable. Okay? And blood sugar stability is key to retention of sharp motor skills and coordination, focus, and mental focus. And so when that happens, you become blood sugar stable. And the thing we see with athletes, particularly like figure skaters, hockey players, soccer players, basketball players, things where sharp motor skills are really needed, what happens is sharp motor skills, they fall off before the athlete even senses fatigue. So like a good example is the Russian figure skater Alexei Yagudin, who performed in 2002. Vespa sponsored him, and he shifted his diet. It wasn't full-blown OFM, but it did include some protein and fat. But Alexei, at that year, he not only won the Salt Lake City Games with perfect scores, men's figure skating competition, he won every competition he entered because he had that blood sugar stability to maintain the sharp motor skills. Now, it wasn't just that he was able to perform in his competitions at that level. What really gave him the advantage was he was able to train at a higher level, because he was recovering faster, that quote unquote recovery, because he wasn't doing the damage. But also the way they train figure skaters is the coach is out there on the ice teaching the athlete. But as soon as the coach notices they get sloppy, they have to pull them, because they're either going to do the move wrong or they're going to fall and hurt themselves. In Alexei's case, he was able to train longer and harder because he didn't have that falling off of the sharp motor skills. And this is one of the things a lot of the endurance athletes, particularly mountain bikers, notice. They just notice that late in a competition or late in a ride, they're not making what they call stupid mistakes.
I'm beginning to sense this theme here, which you've been consistently pounding, this disparity between science and actual real-life results.
And I'm not disparaging the science. I hope I want to make that really clear, but I want to note that there's a difference in how we can use science as a tool to guide us in the real world.
Okay. Yeah, and my concern was all the forum debates that go on for years and years on one little tiny thing. So I'm one of those people who just likes to see results. I'm one of those quick, like, can we get to the point?
Well, and that's the thing is like I've been getting results from my athletes for years. People who are setting records, they're winning major competitions, setting course records, and then your regular person is setting PRs, but I constantly get harassed because it's not science. Where's the science, right? And so there's a need for both of them, and that's the thing. It's like a lot of my work had no credibility until Faster got published. People were winning races, but it was anecdotal. So we have to recognize that in the world we live in today, we live by these science things, and it's important because we'd be kind of going around a lot more chaotically and trial and error if we didn't have the science to guide us. I think it takes out a huge amount of that trial and error. I'm not saying we shouldn't be trying to figure out what fits for us. We should, but with the science to help guide us, like people on this podcast, they know that eating a bowl of pasta, naked pasta, the night before, there's actual science to show that this is not going to work. And what gets me about that is the complete disconnect that people have, like the marathon and bicycle races and all that. Everybody carbs up, does the carb loading pasta feed the night before, and everybody knows that 2 hours into their event they're going to bonk. Nobody gets that the reason they're bonking is because of the carb load they did before literally saturates their bloodstream with insulin, and so that saturation has their ability to tap into their fat at virtually nil. So it means they're basically beholden to any endogenous glycogen stores they have and whatever they can cram down, which is about 2 hours. And so there's science to it, but there's no direct science to that, and people don't think about those contexts. So you see what I'm saying? Like they read the original carb loading studies out of context because those guys were a very different animal than most people who are eating carbs constantly and then carb loading the night before. And they're not looking at the physiology, which is pretty well established. Yeah. And so I don't, I wouldn't be where I am today in terms of getting results if it wasn't for the fact that I've done a lot of reading of the scientific literature, the textbooks on physiology, and discussing things with people like Steve, to be able to guide, the process. You see what I'm saying? So it's sort of like we need both, but we have to understand the place of science. And I think science has been put on this pedestal, and rightly so, in the vein of science and good science. But when we want to apply it to the real world, we have to understand how it works in the real world and how it doesn't work, because of the fact that we're looking at one aspect and we're trying to control all the other variables. And then the real world is this situation that's fraught with variables, and they're going to change. Like, you start an event, like say an endurance event. If you're doing an Ironman triathlon, you're getting in the water, it's cool in the morning, and then all of a sudden you're on the bike, and then even during the bike, it might be cool when you start, but by the time you get halfway through your 112-mile ride, it's starting to heat up. Well, there's things changing, and you're not controlling the variables, and so that's why I'm kind of like stressing this kind of thing.
By the way, Peter, we're burning through time like crazy. You're going to be back. Just realize that pretty soon. Okay. Is there a top? Go ahead.
One of the other things for the listener to understand is, as they go on their fat adapted journey, their dynamics are going to change. So like when you first go from being a carb burning person to a keto person, your sensitivity and your tolerance to carbohydrates will be pretty low. But as you get fitter and you start doing more exercise, and you get more aerobically fit and more keto adapted and stress less, that window is going to open up. So everything's going to change over time. It really is a journey, and there's lots of great tools out there to help us.
Is there a topic you'd like to cover before we start wrapping things up?
No, I'm going to let you wrap it up because I know we've talked a lot, but I wanted to kind of stress that dynamic, and that each individual's, their own journey is going to be very dynamic and changing. So, well, it's amazing.
We've only done half the questions, by the way, so there's a lot of can of worms.
I always have more. Anybody that's worked with me knows when we start out, I have a whole lot more questions than answers.
Which is why I said you're going to be back pretty soon. So when should people reach out to you? What's that? When should people type in your email address and reach out to you?
Well, go to vespapower.com right now, and we're going to be we're making some changes to kind of get more of the information out there. Right now, vespapower.com is the best place to go. And I suggest, rather than try to sell you some Vespa, which I personally believe is great because I got into it because I used it, but rather than try to sell you Vespa, I would rather you go to the OFM site, OFM pages, and start going through that and delving through it. There's lots of podcasts up there, and we'll be starting to resort the podcast. So like this podcast will be on there, and others, and then we have some references, but we'll have a lot more resources in the future to help guide people, because, and that's part of the problem with me is I'm sitting here thinking about it, and we're not out there promoting it, and I'm learning that I got to promote it because it's just like I'm still wondering. I mean, it's a fascinating journey, and I'm curious, and I feel very confident and competent in what I do, but it's just this constantly thinking, developing, and doing rather than promoting type of mindset that we're developing. So, and as you know, a lot of the stuff that's happened in the ketosphere in the last 3 years is, it's just been changed from being unknown to known. And what, back when I started being a principal in Vespa, there's a podcast in 2008 where just we got, you look at the comments and we just ripped to shreds, and I was essentially saying the same thing as I'm saying now. I mean, I'm much further down, and I'm much more knowledgeable than I was then, but I was essentially saying the same thing, and we were just ripped to shreds, and it went on like that for years. And I can only imagine what Steve Phinney went through for 20, 30 years before, Jeff Volek brought him out of retirement and started getting them back into this low carb research, which by the way, they're doing momentous things in type 2 diabetes reversal.
Yeah, with Verta Health and all those things. All right, so they could go to your website, which I will add to the show notes, and it's vespapower.com. Any final last plugs besides this?
Yeah, and if you want to do a coupon code, I'm more than happy to do a coupon code.
Sounds great. Do you want to just lay it out right now and we'll just create it on this podcast?
What's the name of your podcast?
Keto Geek.
Keto Geek. Well, we're going to do the Keto Geek 20% off one-time offer.
All right, sounds good. Guys, try it out. Use our coupon code that we just made and see how it boosts your performance. It sounds very promising, so you might get some interesting traffic.
One of the things I want to say about Vespa is this sounds really like a snake oil salesman, but I'm really kind of like a wasp peptide salesman here. But what you're going to notice is what you don't notice, because when you're using a catalyst to tap into your fat, you're tapping into your natural thing. So you just feel naturally strong. You don't have so when I say what you notice is what you don't notice, you don't have the ups and downs in energy. You don't bonk. You don't have the mental fog, and you're not sore afterwards, and you're not, starving. So that's kind of, it's very subtle. And what we have people do is use it several times, not use it several times, and then they start to, connect the dots. Because, when you're taking something like a gel or an energy drink, you get this big rush and you feel it, and then, you have the crash, and then you take it again, you feel it, and we've been conditioned to think that that's how it's supposed to work. Follow me?
Sounds good. All right. Well, Peter, thank you so much for being on the podcast. You have been quite a blast to chat with.
Yeah, Fahad, it's been a pleasure, and I look forward to chatting more, and hopefully we can get a little more focused and time constrained, because, as you can see, we can talk all day on this.
Definitely. Thank you for listening to the show. You can visit us at ketogeek.com to check out our premium, keto-friendly, and low-carb food products, including our infamous energy pods, made from the best ingredients we could find in the entire country. We also recommend signing up for our newsletter at ketogeek.com/signup, where you get exclusive discounts, rewards, product announcements, and the latest content we are working on. You also get a 10% discount on your entire order when you sign up. Go to ketogeek.com/signup to join the low-carb playground.